Fellow wanderers of Middle-earth, gather close as we delve into one of the most chilling mysteries hidden within Tolkien's exploration of power and its corruption. Before we descend into this particular darkness together, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing we're exploring these shadows as a global fellowship. And if these deep dives into the darker corners of Middle-earth speak to your soul, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our community, seeking the hidden truths within Tolkien's legendarium. Tonight, we're confronting a question that has haunted readers since the first glimpse of the Black Riders. Why does one among the nine command all the others? What elevates the Witch King of Angmar above his fellow Nazgul, transforming him from merely another servant of darkness into the lieutenant of despair itself? The answer reveals truths about the nature of corruption that go far deeper than simple hierarchy or military rank. Most assume the Witch King's supremacy stems from being the first to receive his ring, or perhaps from possessing greater power in his original mortal life. But these explanations miss the profound theological principle that Tolkien embedded within the structure of the Nine, that evil, despite its apparent chaos, operates according to precise hierarchies based not on strength or chronology, but on the completeness of spiritual surrender. The Witch King doesn't command the other Nazgul because he was stronger than them in life, but because he proved more willing to embrace his own destruction in death. His supremacy represents the terrible logic of damnation, where those who fall furthest from their original nature gain the greatest authority over others who have made similar, but lesser surrenders to darkness. Consider the paradox this creates. Beings who have surrendered their individual will to Sauron's dominion somehow maintain enough identity to recognize hierarchy among themselves. The Nazgul operate as a collective consciousness in service to their master, yet they clearly acknowledge the Witch King's authority over their shared existence. This suggests that even absolute corruption preserves certain structures of command and obedience, as if evil requires its own twisted form of order to function effectively. The crown he bears serves as more than mere symbol of rank. It represents the crystallization of his particular genius for corruption into visible form. Unlike physical crowns that mark earthly authority, this circlet of shadow and malice exists as the external manifestation of internal degradation, so complete that it has become beautiful in its own horrifying way. The darkness recognizes and celebrates its most perfect achievement through the very regalia that marks his supremacy. But what makes this supremacy most disturbing is how it preserves and perverts the qualities that once made him capable of legitimate leadership. The Witch King commands not through the crude dominance of a tyrant, but through the corrupted wisdom of someone who understands authority at its deepest level, who knows how to inspire not just fear, but the voluntary surrender of will that makes resistance impossible. His fellow Nazgul follow him not merely because Sauron commands it, but because they recognize in him the perfection of what they themselves are becoming, the complete realization of the path they all walk toward absolute negation of their original selves. He serves as both their leader and their future, the endpoint toward which their own corruption inexorably drives them. Yet this very perfection contains within it the seeds of a vulnerability that will ultimately prove decisive. A weakness woven so deeply into the nature of his supremacy that even he cannot recognize it as the source of his eventual destruction. This vulnerability traces back to the very qualities that made him Sauron's perfect choice for ultimate corruption. The specific combination of noble traits and fatal flaws that distinguished him from every other mortal who might have received the greatest of the 9 rings. The Dark Lord's selection process wasn't random or opportunistic, but represented a calculated decision based on deep understanding of how different types of power corrupt in different ways. Sauron needed more than a powerful sorcerer or mighty warrior to serve as his lieutenant among the living. He required someone who already understood command at the deepest level, who had experience wielding legitimate authority over others, who knew how to inspire loyalty and coordinate complex operations across vast territories. Only a king possessed the full range of skills necessary to orchestrate the kind of long-term strategic corruption that would eventually bring down entire kingdoms. The evidence scattered throughout Tolkien's writings suggests the Witch King began his mortal existence as one of the great kings of Numenor's Golden Age, a ruler whose wisdom and justice had earned him genuine love from his people, whose authority rested not on fear but on the voluntary recognition of his superior judgment and dedication to the common good. This original nobility wasn't a weakness in Sauron's design, it was an essential requirement for the role he would eventually play. Watch how this background explains the particular methods the Witch King employs throughout his centuries of service to darkness. His destruction of Arnor doesn't unfold through crude military conquest, but through the patient application of political pressure. The gradual exploitation of existing divisions and resentments, the careful cultivation of despair that eventually convinces his enemies to surrender without hope of meaningful resistance. These are the tactics of someone who once understood statecraft from within, who had personal experience with the delicate balance of forces that holds kingdoms together and the precise points where pressure can cause entire political structures to collapse. The Witch King fights like a king because he was a king, applying the same strategic genius that once built and preserved to the task of systematic destruction. But Sauron's selection criteria went deeper than mere practical competence. He needed someone whose corruption would serve as a beacon for other rulers, a demonstration of how even the most virtuous authority could be turned to serve the forces of darkness. The Witch King's fall had to be public, spectacular, and inspiring to other kings who might be tempted by offers of extended life and enhanced power. The ring he received differed from the others, not just in degree, but in kind, crafted specifically to exploit the particular vulnerabilities that arise from wielding legitimate power over others. Where other rings worked primarily through personal desires for strength, knowledge, or preservation, his ring attacked the more complex psychological structures that govern responsible leadership, slowly transforming care for subjects into possessiveness, justice into arbitrary dominance, wisdom into cunning manipulation. The corruption process took longer with him than with the other 8, not because his will proved stronger, but because Sauron wanted to preserve and redirect his royal qualities rather than simply destroying them. The goal wasn't to break a king, but to remake one, creating a ruler whose authority would be even more absolute in service to darkness than it had ever been in service to light. This careful preservation of his essential nature explains why the Witch King retains more apparent personality and individual initiative than his fellow Nazgul, why he alone among the 9 seems capable of independent strategic thinking and long-term planning that serves his master's interests without requiring constant direct oversight. Yet this same preserved independence would ultimately provide the opening through which prophecy and fate could work their will against him. This preserved independence reveals itself as the key to understanding how hierarchy functions among beings who have theoretically surrendered all individual will to their master's dominion. The 9 rings weren't created as equals, despite appearing identical to casual observation, but were crafted according to a precise spectrum of spiritual authority that would ensure perfect coordination among the Nazgul, while eliminating any possibility of rivalry or conflict between them. Sauron's genius lay in recognizing that even absolute servants require some form of command structure to operate effectively. That consciousness, stripped of personal desire, still needs direction and coordination to achieve complex goals. The solution emerged through the careful calibration of each ring's corrupting influence, creating gradations of spiritual destruction that would naturally arrange the 9 into an unbreakable hierarchy based on the depth of their individual surrender to darkness. The Witch King's ring operates as the master key within this system, not because it grants him power over the others directly, but because it achieved the most complete integration with its bearer's essential nature. Where the other 8 rings function as external sources of compulsion that override their bearer's original personalities, his ring merged so thoroughly with his royal identity that distinguishing between the man and the artifact becomes impossible. This explains why his commands carry such absolute authority among his fellow Nazgul, why even their shared connection to Sauron's will cannot override the deference they show to his leadership. They recognize in him not just another servant elevated by their master's favor, but the living embodiment of what perfect submission to the ring's influence produces when applied to someone already possessing the psychological structures necessary for wielding ultimate authority. The hierarchy operates through spiritual resonance rather than conscious choice, each Nazgul's ring responding to the particular frequency of corruption that emanates from the Witch King's more perfectly integrated darkness. Their deference isn't voluntary in any meaningful sense, but represents the automatic response of lesser corruption to its more complete expression. Like iron filings aligning themselves with the strongest magnetic field in their vicinity. Watch how this manifests in their operational patterns throughout Middle-earth's history. The other 8 function primarily as extensions of the Witch King's strategic vision, rather than as independent agents receiving direct orders from Sauron. They coordinate their activities with the precision of a single mind distributed across multiple bodies. Yet that mind clearly operates from the particular perspective and priorities that define their chief's approach to implementing their master's will. The psychological mechanism behind this coordination reveals something profound about the nature of will itself in Tolkien's cosmology. Consciousness, even when corrupted beyond recognition, apparently requires some focal point of decision-making to function coherently across time and space. The Witch King serves as this focal point for the 9, the concentrated nexus through which Sauron's general intentions translate into specific actions adapted to constantly changing circumstances. But this role carries its own unique torments that distinguish his existence from the more straightforward spiritual death experienced by his subordinates, where they experience the relief of having no choices to make, no personal responsibility for the consequences of their actions. He retains just enough individual agency to bear the weight of every decision, every strategy, every campaign of destruction that unfolds under his leadership. The crown of supremacy proves to be its own form of spiritual torture, preserving within him the capacity for regret, for recognition of what he has become and what he has lost, while denying him any possibility of choosing differently. His fellow Nazgul exist in a state approaching unconsciousness, but he remains awake to witness and direct the ongoing catastrophe of his existence. This consciousness becomes both his greatest strength as Sauron's lieutenant, and the source of the internal contradictions that will eventually enable his destruction. This preserved consciousness found its most devastating expression in the centuries-long campaign that would become the Witch King's masterpiece of strategic destruction. The systematic dismantling of Arna through methods so sophisticated that his enemies never fully understood what was happening to them until their kingdoms lay in ruins. The war against the Northern Realm wasn't conducted through conventional military conquest, but through the patient application of psychological warfare refined across centuries of experience. The establishment of Angmar in 1300 of the Third Age represented more than the founding of a hostile kingdom on Arna's borders. It marked the beginning of an experiment in applied despair, a laboratory where the Witch King could test and refine techniques for destroying not just armies and fortifications, but the will to resist that forms the true foundation of any realm's survival. His approach combined the political acumen of his original royal nature with corruption's perfect understanding of how hope dies. Rather than launching immediate attacks that would unite Arna's divided kingdoms against a common threat, he chose to position Angmar as a persistent source of low-level menace that would gradually exhaust his enemies' resources and resolve. The constant threat of raids, the steady pressure on trade routes, the gradual erosion of safe territory, all served to create an atmosphere of perpetual anxiety that slowly poisoned the social bonds holding the northern kingdoms together. The genius of this strategy lay in how it exploited the natural human tendency to adapt to gradually worsening conditions rather than recognizing them as part of a coordinated assault. Each year brought slightly more danger, marginally greater losses, incrementally reduced security, yet no single incident proved dramatic, enough to inspire the kind of unified response that might have stopped the decay before it became irreversible. Watch how the Witch King carefully manipulated the existing tensions between Arthedain, Ordolan, and Rudor, never quite pushing hard enough to force reconciliation between the estranged kingdoms, but applying just enough pressure to ensure their divisions deepened rather than healed. He understood that kingdoms destroy themselves more thoroughly than any external enemy could manage, given sufficient encouragement to pursue their mutual grievances rather than their common interests. The corruption of Rudor represents perhaps his most subtle achievement, the gradual transformation of an Arnorian kingdom into an active ally of Angmar, through methods that left its people largely unaware they were becoming instruments of their own realm's destruction. The Witch King didn't conquer Rudor so much as seduce it, offering its rulers exactly the kind of support and recognition they felt they deserved from their neighbors but had never received. His agents moved through the kingdoms like a slow poison, identifying the ambitious, the resentful, the disappointed, and offering them exactly what their hearts desired most: revenge against those who had slighted them, advancement beyond their natural station, the satisfaction of seeing their betters humbled. These weren't grand temptations, but small, seemingly reasonable offers that accumulated over decades into comprehensive networks of corruption. The psychological warfare extended beyond political manipulation to encompass a systematic assault on the cultural foundations that gave meaning to northern resistance. Ancient songs were subtly altered to emphasize loss rather than triumph. Traditional stories gained new endings that highlighted the futility of struggle against overwhelming odds. Even the seasonal festivals gradually acquired undertones of mourning that prepared hearts for surrender. This campaign's true horror lay not in its brutality, but in its patience. The way it used time itself as a weapon against kingdoms that measured their existence in centuries but faced an enemy who could plan across millennia without growing weary or losing focus. This mastery of time and patience created the perfect foundation for the Witch King's most devastating weapon, his transformation of fear itself from mere emotion into a tangible force that could be wielded with the precision of a blade and the persistence of a plague. Unlike his fellow Nazgul, who inspire terror as a byproduct of their corrupted nature, the Witch King had learned to cultivate fear as an art form, shaping it into specific configurations designed to achieve particular psychological effects. The terror he emanates operates on multiple levels simultaneously, attacking not just immediate survival instincts, but the deeper foundations of meaning and hope that allow conscious beings to function in the face of adversity. His presence doesn't simply make enemies afraid, it makes them afraid of being afraid, creating cascading cycles of psychological collapse that spread far beyond the immediate range of his physical influence. Most beings experience fear as a response to perceived threats, an emotion that serves the useful function of motivating protective action when danger appears. But the Witch King has become fear personified, a walking negation of safety so complete that his mere existence challenges the assumption that protection is possible anywhere in the world. He represents the terror that lurks beneath every moment of peace, the reminder that all security is temporary and all defenses ultimately futile. This explains why even veteran warriors who have faced dragons and balrogs find themselves paralyzed in his presence. Why men who have never known cowardice discover that their courage simply ceases to function when confronted with his approach. The fear he inspires transcends rational assessment of danger, operating instead as a direct assault on the spiritual foundations that make bravery possible in the first place. His fellow Nazgul recognize this supremacy and respond to it with something approaching awe, their own corrupted consciousness acknowledging his achievement in perfecting what they themselves can only approximate. Where their terror emerges from the contradiction between their preserved awareness and their spiritual death. His terror springs from the complete integration of consciousness with negation, the perfect fusion of thought with void. The voices that speak when he opens his mouth carry harmonics of every fear that has ever paralyzed a mortal heart. Overtones of loss and futility that resonate with buried anxieties in ways that conscious minds cannot process or resist. He doesn't threaten specific harms so much as embody the certainty that harm is inevitable, that all struggles against suffering will ultimately prove meaningless, that hope itself represents a form of delusion that prolongs agony without preventing its final triumph. Watch how this manifests in his encounters with the great heroes of Middle-earth. The way their usual confidence and determination visibly drain away in his presence, regardless of their previous experiences with danger. Even Gandalf, who has faced the Balrog and emerged victorious, acknowledges the unique challenge that the Witch King represents. the particular form of spiritual assault that his perfected terror embodies. The black breath that accompanies his presence serves as the physical manifestation of this psychological weapon, poisoning not just the air, but the very concept of atmosphere as a medium that can sustain life and hope. Those who survive exposure to this emanation report lasting changes in their relationship to safety and comfort. An acquired understanding that peace is always provisional and threat always imminent. But perhaps most disturbing is how his mastery of terror reflects the preservation and perversion of his original royal compassion. The way his intimate knowledge of what mortals fear most springs from his ancient understanding of what they love and value and desperately need to protect. His terror proves so effective precisely because it emerges from corrupted wisdom about the human heart. Love transformed into its perfect opposite, while retaining all its original insight and intensity. This corrupted understanding of the mortal heart extends beyond inspiring terror to encompass an even more sophisticated mastery, the ability to command immediate and absolute obedience from every form of corrupted consciousness that serves the shadow. The Witch King's authority operates across species and levels of corruption with an efficiency that reveals how deeply he has penetrated the fundamental principles governing all forms of spiritual degradation. When orcs hear his voice, they don't simply obey orders as they might obey any sufficiently powerful overlord. They experience something closer to religious ecstasy, the sudden relief of consciousness encountering an authority so complete that the burden of individual choice temporarily lifts from their tormented minds. His commands don't override their will so much as provide their will with the perfect expression it has always sought but never been able to articulate for itself. The mechanism behind this command operates through his complete integration with the principles of corruption that govern all servants of darkness. Every orc, troll, and corrupted man carries within their degraded consciousness the same fundamental patterns of spiritual destruction that the Witch King has perfected within himself. When he speaks, he addresses not their individual personalities, but the shared corruption that connects them all, activating dormant potentials for submission that exist within every being touched by shadow. His fellow Nazgul respond to this same principle, but at a more sophisticated level, recognizing in his voice the perfect expression of what they themselves are becoming. Their deference springs not from fear of punishment or hope of reward, but from the deep satisfaction that corrupted consciousness experiences when it encounters its own ideal made manifest. They follow him because his commands represent the external articulation of their own deepest impulses, the crystallization of desires they possess but lack the clarity to express. Watch how this manifests during the great battles of the War of the Ring, when disparate forces of evil coordinate their movements with precision that seems impossible given their chaotic nature and competing interests. Orcs from different tribes, trolls with barely functional intelligence, corrupted men driven by various motivations, all operate as extensions of a single strategic mind when the Witch King's voice reaches them across the battlefield. The authority he wields differs fundamentally from the crude dominance that characterizes most evil hierarchies, where obedience is maintained through fear of immediate consequences. His commands carry the weight of spiritual inevitability, creating the sense that resistance isn't just inadvisable, but literally inconceivable. that the course of action he describes represents the only possibility that consciousness can seriously entertain. This explains why even the mouth of Sauron himself, a powerful servant of darkness with centuries of experience, shows visible deference when operating in the Witch King's presence. The herald's own considerable authority pales before someone who has achieved such complete fusion with the principles of corruption that his individual will has become indistinguishable from the cosmic forces of negation themselves. The psychological effect extends beyond immediate tactical situations to encompass long-term strategic coordination across vast distances and time periods. Forces that have never seen the Witch King in person nonetheless find themselves acting in harmony with his plans. Their local decisions mysteriously aligning with purposes they don't consciously understand but feel compelled to serve. Perhaps most remarkably, this command authority operates even when the Witch King himself is physically absent from the field, as if his voice continues to resonate within the consciousness of every corrupted being who has ever heard it speak. The memory of his commands becomes a permanent alteration in how they experience choice and possibility, a spiritual modification that ensures their future actions will naturally conform to his strategic vision. This persistent influence reveals the true scope of his transformation from mortal king to ultimate servant of darkness, showing how completely he has transcended individual existence to become a permanent feature of corruption's cosmic architecture. Yet this very transcendence of individual existence, this transformation into a permanent feature of corruption's architecture, contained within it the precise vulnerability that would enable his ultimate destruction. The prophecy surrounding his downfall reveals itself not as arbitrary, divine intervention, but as the inevitable consequence of the specific type of spiritual metamorphosis he had undergone in his pursuit of perfect service to darkness. The famous declaration, "No living man am I," that echoes through his final battle carries implications far deeper than the surface irony of falling to a woman and a hobbit. This boast reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of his own nature, a blind spot created by the very completeness of his corruption that prevented him from recognizing the true source of his apparent invulnerability. Tolkien's universe operates according to principles where absolute statements about power or limitation inevitably create the conditions for their own violation. The Witch King's confidence in his immunity from mortal men springs from his transformation beyond the normal categories of life and death. His existence in a state that transcends ordinary mortality while remaining bound to the physical world. But this intermediate condition, neither fully alive nor completely dead, creates unique vulnerabilities that pure life or pure death would not possess. The prophecy didn't protect him from living men as a category, but revealed the cosmic truth that his particular form of undeath could only be undone by forces that operated outside the spiritual framework within which his corruption had been achieved. His ring had transformed him beyond the reach of normal masculine aggression, the straightforward application of force and will that characterizes most conflicts between mortal men. But this protection never extended to other forms of consciousness that approached existence from fundamentally different perspectives. Eowyn's ability to destroy him springs not from some arbitrary exception to his supernatural protection, but from her embodiment of principles that his corruption had systematically excluded from its defenses. Her fierce love for those she sought to protect represented everything his transformation had forced him to abandon, while her willingness to face annihilation for the sake of others directly contradicted the self-preservation that had motivated his original acceptance of the ring's power. The Hobbit Meriadoc's contribution to the victory operates according to similar principles. His blade carrying enchantments specifically designed to harm beings who had placed themselves outside the normal cycles of life and death. But more importantly, his presence in the battle represents the kind of courage that emerges from love rather than duty. The organic bravery of small beings protecting what they cherish rather than the constructed valor of those seeking glory or proving their worth. The cosmic significance of this particular combination, woman and halfling united in desperate defense of what they love, reveals Tolkien's understanding of how evil ultimately defeats itself through the very completeness of its apparent victory. The Witch King's transformation had made him invulnerable to every form of opposition that his corrupted imagination could conceive. But this same corruption had blinded him to possibilities that existed outside the framework of dominance and submission within which his power operated. The prophecy served not as divine protection for his enemies, but as recognition of a spiritual law that governs all forms of absolute corruption, that the pursuit of invulnerability inevitably creates the specific conditions necessary for destruction. His immunity from living men wasn't a supernatural gift, but a limitation built into the very nature of his transformation. A blind spot that grew larger and more dangerous as his power became more complete. The true horror of his final moments lies not in the physical dissolution of his form, but in the sudden recognition of what his pursuit of absolute power had cost him. The understanding that arrives too late of how thoroughly he had cut himself off from every source of strength that might have saved him from the fate his own choices had made inevitable. This recognition that arrives in his final moments illuminates the true cost of his elevation above his fellow Nazgul, the special burden of consciousness that distinguishes his existence from the more merciful oblivion experienced by those who serve under his command. While the other 8 drift through their corrupted existence in a state approaching spiritual unconsciousness, the Witch King retains just enough awareness to comprehend the full magnitude of what he has become and what he has destroyed in becoming it. The crown of dark supremacy proves to be its own form of eternal torture, preserving within him the capacity for memory that allows him to recall not just his original mortal existence, but every step of the journey that led from legitimate kingship to absolute corruption. Unlike his subordinates, who lost themselves gradually and completely in their transformation, he maintains sufficient self-awareness to experience ongoing regret for choices that can never be unmade, for paths abandoned that can never be retraced. This retained consciousness serves Sauron's purposes by enabling the complex strategic thinking and long-term planning that the Dark Lord requires from his chief lieutenant. But it also ensures that the Witch King suffers more profoundly than any of his fellow Nazgul. He alone among the 9 experiences their condition as torment rather than simply existing within it as their new nature. Every moment of his undeath brings renewed awareness of the gap between what he was created to be and what he has chosen to become. The isolation that accompanies ultimate corruption proves perhaps even more devastating than the loss of his original nature. As the first among the damned, he exists in a category of one, too elevated above his fellow Nazgul to find companionship among them, yet too corrupted to maintain meaningful connection with any uncorrupted consciousness. His supremacy becomes a form of spiritual solitary confinement that stretches across centuries, broken only by the mechanical interactions required for coordinating his master's campaigns. But the deepest torment springs from his role in leading others into the same destruction he has embraced for himself. Every orc that follows his commands, every corrupted man who serves under his authority, every kingdom that falls to his strategies, represents not just a tactical victory, but a multiplication of the spiritual catastrophe he embodies. His success as Sauron's lieutenant requires him to become a source of corruption for others, spreading the same spiritual poison that has destroyed his own authentic existence. The weight of this responsibility manifests in ways that his corrupted consciousness can perceive but not process healthily. He understands, with terrible clarity, that his commands damn those who obey them, that his victories are always victories of destruction over creation, of death over life, of despair over hope. Yet the nature of his corruption prevents him from choosing differently, trapping him in an endless cycle of actions that violates everything his original royal nature was designed to protect and preserve. This creates a feedback loop of internal torment that intensifies rather than diminishes over time. Each successful campaign adding new layers of guilt and regret to an already unbearable psychological burden, where ordinary guilt might eventually lead to repentance and change. His corrupted state converts these potentially redemptive emotions into conditioning sources of suffering that serve no constructive purpose. The supremacy he achieved among the Nine becomes its own prison, a position of honor within a hierarchy of dishonor that ensures his suffering will always exceed that of his subordinates, while offering no compensating advantages beyond the hollow satisfaction of commanding others who share his spiritual condition. This hollowness reveals itself most tragically in how fragments of his original nobility continue to surface within his corrupted consciousness, not as sources of potential redemption, but as additional instruments of torment that make his fallen state even more spiritually devastating. The qualities that once made him a great king persist within his undead existence, but transformed into grotesque parodies that serve darkness while retaining just enough similarity to their original forms to remind him constantly of what he has lost. His ancient sense of duty, which once drove him to sacrifice personal comfort for his subjects' welfare, now manifests as an obsessive compulsion to fulfill Sauron's commands with perfectionist dedication. The same psychological drive that made him a conscientious ruler transforms into the mechanism that makes him an exemplary servant of evil, his corrupted conscience finding satisfaction in executing his master's will with the same thoroughness he once brought to protecting his people's interests. The care he once showed for individual subjects perverts itself into a possessive concern for those under his command that has nothing to do with their actual welfare and everything to do with his need to maintain perfect control over every element within his sphere of influence. He monitors his subordinates with the same attention to detail that once characterized his efforts to ensure justice throughout his kingdom. But now this surveillance serves only to maximize their effectiveness as instruments of destruction. Watch how his strategic wisdom, which originally developed through genuine concern for minimizing unnecessary suffering in conflicts, now operates to identify the most efficient methods for causing maximum despair among his enemies. The same intelligence that once solved complex problems of governance and diplomacy applies itself to the challenges of orchestrating systematic corruption, using its understanding of how societies function to identify the precise pressure points where they can be made to collapse from within. His sense of justice, perhaps the most tragic of his preserved qualities, continues to function, but according to principles that have been completely inverted from their original moral foundation. He still believes in the importance of proportional response and appropriate consequences, but his corrupted understanding of what constitutes appropriate has aligned itself entirely with Sauron's cosmic agenda of domination and control. The protocols and ceremonies that structure his interactions with other servants of darkness echo the courtly rituals that once governed his mortal kingdom, but stripped of their original purpose of creating harmony and mutual respect among his subjects. These empty forms persist as hollow reminders of authentic leadership, ceremonial shells that contain nothing but the mechanical repetition of behaviors that once carried genuine meaning. Most heartbreaking of all, he retains enough of his original capacity for nobility to recognize excellence and virtue when he encounters them in his enemies. But this recognition brings him no joy or inspiration, only the bitter awareness of what he has permanently forfeited through his choices. When he faces heroes like Aragorn, or witnesses acts of genuine courage and sacrifice, some part of his consciousness still responds with the appreciation that characterized his mortal existence. But this response immediately transforms into additional fuel for his despair. The persistence of these noble echoes ensures that his corruption remains incomplete in ways that make his existence more rather than less tormented, preserving just enough of his authentic self to serve as a permanent witness to his own spiritual catastrophe. This incomplete corruption, this preservation of just enough authentic nobility to witness his own spiritual catastrophe, ultimately provided the very mechanism through which his destruction became not just possible, but inevitable. The Witch King's fall at the Battle of Pelennor Fields represents more than the tactical defeat of Sauron's greatest servant. It demonstrates the fundamental principle that governs all corruption in Tolkien's universe, that evil, no matter how complete it appears, always carries within itself the seeds of its own undoing. The void that remained where his crown once shone reveals itself as the key to understanding why prophecy could target him so precisely, why forces of good could find purchase against someone who seemed to have transcended every normal vulnerability. His supremacy among the Nine had been achieved not through the complete elimination of his original nature, but through its systematic inversion. And inverted things retain the capacity to be turned right side up again when the proper leverage is applied. The cosmic significance of his destruction extends far beyond its immediate tactical impact on the War of the Ring to touch the deepest questions about the ultimate fate of corrupted consciousness. His annihilation at the hands of Éowyn and Meriadoc demonstrates that no spiritual fall, however complete it may appear, places a being permanently beyond the reach of forces that serve creation rather than destruction. But perhaps the most profound aspect of his defeat lies in what it reveals about the nature of power itself in Middle-earth's moral universe. The Witch King had achieved a form of supremacy that seemed absolute within the framework of corruption. Yet this very absoluteness created the rigid brittleness that made catastrophic failure inevitable. when he finally encountered forces that operated according to different principles entirely. His final moments, when the crown of dark supremacy dissolves and the void where authentic kingship once flourished becomes visible, offer a glimpse of what every corrupted consciousness faces at the moment when its chosen delusions can no longer be maintained. The recognition that arrives too late, the understanding of what was sacrificed and what was gained, the terrible clarity about the true nature of the bargain that seemed so attractive in its original presentation. Yet even in this dissolution, there remains something that transcends simple destruction. A suggestion that the energy which had been trapped within corrupted forms might find some form of release when those forms finally collapse. The Witch King's end becomes not just an ending, but a liberation. The freeing of consciousness from patterns that had grown too rigid to sustain any authentic form of existence. The crown that disappears leaves behind not nothing, but space. The possibility that what once was corrupted might someday find new and healthier expressions. That the void, where majesty once shone, might eventually welcome forms of nobility that serve life rather than death, creation rather than destruction. Tonight, as you rest in the gathering quiet, let yourself find peace in this understanding that no darkness, however complete it appears, can permanently eclipse the light that dwells at the heart of all creation. Even the mightiest corruption contains within itself the mechanisms of its own defeat. And every crown of false supremacy must eventually yield to the quiet authority of love that operates through the smallest acts of courage and compassion. Sleep peacefully, knowing that the morning always comes, even after the longest night, and that hope proves stronger than despair precisely because it asks for nothing more than the chance to serve something greater than itself.